The chandelier over the university's founders' hall sparkled like a constellation, diamonds of light suspended above linen and status. The stage had been erected in front of the 19th-century oil portraits, names that sold embossed sweatshirts and alumni license plates. Silver place cards arranged donors by annual giving tiers. The quartet in the balcony tuned to a polite, cultured hush. Across the room, former classmates who hadn't remembered my name at 23 now recognized my face from magazine covers and step-and-repeat photos. They stared because they were trained to stare at money. They did not know yet that their institution now answered to mine. At the center table sat President Arthur Voss, jaw set in its usual patrician angle, and beside him the trustees, hedge funds in tuxedos, endowments in pearls. A banner behind the lectern read Heritage Business School Centennial Gala. Their founding myth was America's favorite, grit lacquered with legacy. Tonight, they would celebrate themselves in an acoustics-perfect hall, under the illusion that the future would keep arriving exactly on time, with the same donors, the same deference, the same little circle where invitations, internships, and influence traded hands like heirlooms. I set my clutch on the white tablecloth and adjusted the cuff of my black dress. Ryan leaned closer without looking like he had. "Breathe," he whispered. I said. "You're cataloging exit routes," he murmured, smiling at the dessert forks like he was evaluating patisserie instead of structural load-bearing beams and the distance to both side doors. Force of habit. I glanced toward the mezzanine where two of my attorneys occupied the aisle seats, Catherine Morrison, hair-pinned with surgical precision, and James Chin, our transaction specialist in a midnight tux that could slide from cork to cocktail without changing its posture. On Catherine's left was a compact woman with a neat, precise smile, Professor Evelyn Shaw, the interim chair of the accounting department, who had quietly agreed to serve as liaison for what came next. To my right, the Foundation's executive director, Natalie, checked the run of show on a folded program and then looked at me for a fraction too long, the way a friend does when she's keeping a secret that isn't really secret anymore. President Voss rose, tapping his spoon to the crystal. "Friends," he said, and let the word echo off the old wood and donor plaques. "A century ago, Heritage began with 12 students and a ledger book. Tonight, we honor the same spirit, ambition married to responsibility." There was a time his voice would have made my stomach twist, because it had been that tone, the patina of reasonable authority, that told me 15 years earlier that I was not a cultural fit. Not of the mold. The admissions counselor had smiled, as if rejecting me were an act of mercy. The interview had included 2 questions about a polish, 3 about grit, and 0 about the commercial operations I'd built from a second-hand laptop and a shipping pallet in my parents' garage. On the sidewalk outside the brick gates, I had held the white envelope with its gentle language and thought, "You will never ask to sit at their table. If you ever come back, bring your own." I went home. I worked. I bought broken companies with warehouses of good bones, and I put them back together with logistics and math and fewer adjectives. I learned what bankers respect when the floor falls out, cash, covenants, and someone who answers the phone on Sunday. I learned what private equity respects, returns that don't make excuses. I learned what universities respect, liquidity, credit ratings, accreditation, and the word restricted. On paper it looks like revenge. The truth is simpler, I became the person I needed at 23. When the call from Heritage finally came, it sounded like fate wearing a tie. It was not the president who called. It was a trustee who didn't recognize that I had once sat, invisible, at the back of their info session. He spoke in the softened vowels of someone who'd attended schools with lawns. After the pandemic, after the housing shock, after the tuition protests, after the donors shifted to flashier causes, the endowment's private investments had underperformed. The foundation had drawn beyond its comfort. Moody's had used the words negative outlook. A bond covenant wanted ratios the budget could not produce. They needed bridge funding before their fiscal year sailed into shoals. And then, because Heritage adored theater, they needed an anonymous benefactor to headline a centennial campaign to restore the myth with sensible applause. "I'll need to see the indenture," I said, "because love is a language and mine is diligence." We met in a glass boardroom overlooking a quad full of leaf piles and recruitment banners. Catherine sat at my left, James at my right. Across the table, the university's general counsel stacked thick binders as if the mass of paper could compensate for gravity. They explained that Heritage, like many institutions that confused endowment size with immunity, had issued revenue bonds through a conduit authority, promising to keep certain ratios sweet, days cash on hand, debt service coverage, net tuition dependency within a defined tolerance. A master trust secured the bonds with pledged revenues and a negative pledge on new liens. There were forbearance agreements that had kept the rating agencies calm through 2 uneven years. There was an accelerated call feature if certain events of default, those lovely, surgical words, occurred. "Who's the majority holder?" James asked. "Distributed," counsel replied. "But the largest block is held by North Crescent Municipal Opportunities." I looked at Ryan. He didn't blink. North Crescent was one of the funds that always believed they would own the world because they were too busy to suspect anyone else might be in the room. They were also, conveniently, sellers when a thesis aged out. Would North Crescent entertain a discussion, I asked mildly, about a secondary market transaction? The general counsel took off his glasses and cleaned them as if clarity were something you could polish into being. I couldn't say. "Good," I said. Because I already did. A month earlier, before the Gala committee printed its programs, our foundation's qualified entity had been quietly assembling a position. Not a scandal. Not a raid. A purchase at a prudent discount through open market mechanics, disclosed as required to people who actually read. Our intention letter included a phrase I cherish, step-in rights, contingent upon default, negotiated via a supplemental indenture ratified by requisite holders. The university had signed because paperwork is a language and they were fluent in desperation. It did not make us villains. It made us the adults in the room. I didn't want to own Heritage. I wanted it healthy. The school taught bright first-gen kids alongside legacy surnames, and the best of its faculty still believed teaching was a public trust. But the institution's culture, the one that had patted my head at 23, had learned to rank value by zip code and last names. The only tool that culture respected was leverage written in clauses they already believed in. So we prepared the one thing an old institution will not ignore, a covenant clock, ticking in the dark. On the night of the gala, President Voss worked the room with both palms open, like he could catch Goodwill midair. He was smooth because smooth had always worked. He announced the silent auction items, weekend in Aspen, dinner with a celebrity alum, a corporate box at something televised. He praised the campaign's anchor pledge, from an anonymous benefactor, a $50 million commitment, structured as a matching grant, dedicated to scholarships, faculty hiring, and local small business incubators. He did not say the funds would be released only upon the university meeting the governance conditions in the side letter he had initialed without a smile. When they dimmed the hall and cued the historical montage, I thought of the day I'd opened my rejection letter in a borrowed blazer. The film showed glossy footage, Nobel-adjacent laureates, a stadium crowd singing the fight song, a spreadsheet animating upward while an orchestra grew brave. The narrator intoned, "A century of excellence. A future defined by vision." In the darkness between frames, my phone buzzed. A single line from James, North Crescent fully settled. Position confirmed. Consent threshold exceeded. "Everything all right?" Ryan asked, not taking his eyes off the screen. "They just turned on the lights," I said. At dessert, the MC struck a tone like champagne, bright, effervescent. "Tonight," she said, "we also honor a story of full-circle generosity. 15 years ago, a young woman applied to Heritage Business School and was not admitted. She went on to build companies that employ thousands, to lead turnarounds that saved towns, to found a philanthropic organization that changed how we talk about equitable enterprise. When we began this campaign, we received word of a transformative gift from an anonymous benefactor. She wished to remain unnamed so the focus would stay on the mission. But we thought," here she paused for the rehearsed laugh, "that perhaps just this once she might allow us to say her name." The audience tilted as if the room itself wanted to see. The spotlight slid across the head table and found me. People clapped because that's what you do when a story lands on cue. Somewhere in the third row, a former classmate covered her mouth with a napkin and then lowered it slowly as if this new reality required oxygen. My mother would have cried if she'd been a crier. She would have also told me not to gloat. I do not gloat, I document. I stood, not quickly, not slowly, and the applause gathered like distant surf. When I reached the lectern, I rested my fingertips on the edges because it steadied the gesture and it kept me from pulling the side letter out too soon. Thank you, I said. You've been very generous, tonight and for 100 years. I've been asked to say a few words about what it feels like to be rejected. A polite laugh. I let it have a moment and then let it die. It felt, I said, like being measured with a ruler that had been whittled to fit a pocket. 15 years ago, I wore the wrong suit and the wrong story. I did not have the club, I had receipts. Your admissions committee did not like receipts. I smiled. Life liked them fine. I told them what I wish someone had said to me then, that value does not ask permission to exist, that credentials can be excellent shortcuts, but they are not the road, that the economy needs many kinds of intelligence, including the kind that shows up when a truck doesn't. I kept it brief. I did not tell them about eating dinner on upside-down cardboard boxes the year we could not afford chairs because we were buying inventory with cash. I did not tell them about the time a banker called me kid, and I sent him a wire so clean he called me a ma'am for a decade. They didn't need my origin story. They needed a plan. There are, however, I said, 2 housekeeping items. I nodded to the balcony. Catherine rose and walked to the side door that led backstage. James stood in the aisle, an envelope in one hand. The board chair frowned, not yet worried but practicing. President Voss smiled the smile of a man who knows a donor wants a plaque. First, I continued, the anonymous gift is indeed real, and it is restricted. I let the word sit on the table between us. Restricted means it must be used exactly as stated, scholarships for students whose resumes do not read like zip codes, endowed chairs for faculty who produce scholarship and not simply status, and a revolving fund for small business incubation in the town that services your pride every football Saturday. Those are not suggestions. Those are conditions. That is how the money will be dispersed, by match, by milestone, by calendar, through the Heritage Futures Foundation, our fiduciary arm. A rustle along the trustees' table. The donor relations VP shifted in her seat, calculating how many naming opportunities could be salvaged out of conditions that did not prioritize brass letters. Second, I said, and the room found a new kind of attention, the university's revenue bonds. As of this afternoon, the Heritage Futures Foundation's qualified affiliate has, in the open market, acquired a controlling position in your most recent series. We have agreed, via supplemental indenture, to a revised forbearance schedule and certain step-in rights if agreed ratios are not met. Before anyone panics, and here I smiled at the exact man. Who should, we do not intend to call the bonds. We intend to stabilize the institution. But we will not allow the budget to balance itself on the backs of students who believed your brochures. Silence, that exquisite instrument. It holds a room better than sound. The board chair looked at President Voss, whose mouth had drawn into its first honest line of the evening. The general counsel half stood, then sat. The alumni in sequins blinked as if someone had opened a window and let November in. I continued. The conditions are straightforward. Governance reform in 4 parts. I held up a hand and ticked them off like line items. 1. 2 new trustees with backgrounds in public interest finance and community development, elected this quarter. 2. A sunset clause on legacy admissions with a transparent diversity recruitment plan. 3. A tuition freeze for 2 years, funded by operational efficiencies and endowment realignment, the same efficiencies you demand of companies you invest in when you chair investment committees. 4. Faculty governance restored in areas of curriculum and research priorities, real authority, not a seat at the children's table. I nodded toward James. He handed the envelope to an usher, who carried it to the board chair as if it contained a crown. This, I said, is the executed copy of the supplemental indenture, the side letter on gift restrictions, and the draft of the amended bylaws that our council prepared in consultation with faculty representatives and accreditation advisors. You will notice that accreditation is a priority because we are adults. A laugh, smaller this time, equally useful. You may ask why power should come with conditions, I said, and let my eyes travel across the old portraits. Because money without conditions built the kind of comfort that got you here. And comfort is lovely until the ratio breaks, the rating moves, and you discover that values are cheaper to maintain than myths. On the mezzanine, Professor Shaw stood, smoothing her skirt, and walked to the stage steps. In her hands she carried a simple folder. I stepped aside and let her take the microphone. I chair accounting, she said, voice steady, and I'm also the first person in my family to finish college. When I came here, I believed that means mattered as much as ends. The past decade has taught me otherwise. I support these conditions because they restore the job I came here to do. She looked at the board chair. Teach students who will not inherit the world how to build parts of it anyway. Applause began from a corner that did not usually lead applause, the faculty section, then student leaders scattered across the far tables joined, then, reluctantly, and then less reluctantly, donors clapped like people recalibrating their posture to a newly visible horizon. I knew what this was, a vote with hands instead of bylaws. But it mattered because culture counts votes in rooms like this. President Voss stepped to the lectern, recollecting the dignity that had brought him here. We are grateful, he began, and then stopped, because gratitude was not the right word and because he was smart enough to change key mid-song. We will review these documents with council, he said, and we will convene the executive committee this evening. He glanced at the board chair, who nodded. Our commitment is to the mission. Good, I said, and let the microphone find air. Then we're aligned. The rest of the evening unfolded with the strained grace of people learning new choreography. The quartet played, but softer. Conversations shifted from vacations to governance as if a fashion had changed. The donor with the loudest opinions about woke priorities performed a credible impression of someone who'd always supported community incubation funds. A trustee whispered to another about days cash on hand as if speaking the phrase could conjure it. The students, the ones who'd been invited to fill optics, clustered near the doors, electric with possibility. Ryan squeezed my hand under the table, not triumph, confirmation. In the anteroom behind the stage, Catherine laid out the signatures like a card game where every hand was winning. Amendment language is tight, she said. We were careful with UPMFA references, donor intent is armor, not weapon. Indentures forbearance clock starts Monday. Accreditors will like the faculty governance points. North Crescent? I asked James. They'll write op-eds about maintaining standards, he said dryly, and then thank us privately for preserving value. And if the board balks? Catherine looked at me over the rim of her glasses. They won't. The call risk alone will get them in line. And if they do balk, step-in rights are real. You'll be dull, transparent, and unignorable. Dull is holy, I said. Ryan leaned against the sideboard stacked with coffee urns and petit fours arranged like architecture. You didn't tell them the line, he said. They weren't ready, I replied. Tell me, Professor Shaw said, half teasing, half serious. I thought of the rejection letter's neat paragraphs, the way it made something that hurt sound like a door gently closing. When I applied, I said, they told me I lacked polish. Tonight, they learned I collect policies. We returned to the hall for the final toast. The MC, now a little desperate to knit the night back into a gala, lifted a flute of champagne. To a second century, she said brightly, of excellence. To a first century, I said quietly to Ryan, of accountability. We raised our glasses anyway, because ritual matters even when it is being revised. The fallout was textbook. The board convened in a wood-paneled room at the back of Founders Hall and voted to adopt the reforms, not unanimously but decisively enough that the story would not wobble if anyone asked. The alumni newsletter used the word partnership repeatedly, as corporate as it was soothing. The student paper said what student papers say when they are brilliant and free enough to publish it, about time. The bond market noticed what bond markets notice, discipline and disclosure, and relaxed a couple of basis points. Faculty held a meeting the next week that ran long only because hope requires more logistics than cynicism. 2 trustees resigned on principle, and their principles were as predictable as their replacements were qualified. President Voss, having been both a symbol and a function, submitted a resignation that would take effect at the end of the academic year. He delivered the news in a town hall meeting where he looked, for the first time, like a man unclenching. In private, he thanked me for not breaking the institution he loved. I thanked him for not pretending he had built it. We established the scholarship committee with representatives from financial aid, first-gen student groups, and a dean who knew how to read a tax return that did not include trust income. The revolving fund's first investment went to a cafe 2 blocks from campus where the owner employed students on shifts that respected exam weeks. The endowed chairs went to a behavioral economist who was better at data than at parties, a supply chain scholar who had actually run warehouses, and a public finance expert who could explain municipal bonds to a poet. I sat in on those interviews not because I wanted control, but because I wanted to hear how the candidates talked about students who looked like I had at 23, hungry, tired of being hungry. There was blowback, of course. An op-ed in a national magazine foretold the death of classical education beneath the tyranny of donor-driven micromanagement, which would have been funnier if the previous decade had not been precisely that. An alumnus with a podcast complained for 3 episodes about hostile takeovers, a phrase I'm fond of because it reveals who thinks institutions belong to them. A board aspirant sent me a binder of his achievements, including a photo of himself standing near a person who once ran a company. I sent him the bylaws instead. On a quiet morning in late November, 10 days after the gala, I walked past the admissions office where the letter with my name had been printed 15 years earlier. The building smelled like old paper and new paint. On a table in the lobby sat a stack of brochures with photographs of students in sunlight, faces upturned to a future that looked like a catalog. A tour group filed past, a guide delivering the jokes you deliver when you're 19 and wearing a polo. I watched their parents pretend not to count. Upstairs, I requested my file because I am sentimental about receipts. The counselor, new, kind, handed me a folder in which a younger version of me lived in black ink. Strong operations instinct, a note read, but lacks polish. Another, not convinced she's a cultural fit. The years had sanded the sting down to something useful. I left the folder where it belonged, in a place that keeps records because it believes records matter. On the way out, I stopped at the bronze plaque of donors who had sponsored the restoration of Founders Hall. Our foundation's name was there now, not enormous, not small. We had chosen a line that said exactly enough, futures are operational. It was a joke and a thesis, and it pleased me more than my name would have. Outside, the November air had that clean, argued with quality that only certain coastal cities can produce. Students hurried across the quad with coffees and casebooks, performing the eternal exchange of youthful time for credentialed hope. A groundskeeper on a small tractor waved. I waved back because I have always liked the people who hold the place together. Ryan stepped beside me and handed me a paper cup. Latte diplomacy, he said. Did we do it? I asked, not needing the answer but desiring the ritual. We moved the center of gravity an inch, he said, which is what victory looks like when you're working with institutions older than your grandparents. The rest is maintenance. I like maintenance, I said. It's the opposite of myth. We walked to the edge of campus where the town began, not a boundary but a seam. In a window, a handwritten sign announced the incubator's first cohort, a solar installation crew owned by 2 alumni who had tired of consulting about possibility and wanted to install it, a bilingual childcare co-op run by students and grandmothers, a robotics repair shop that promised discounts during finals week. On the sidewalk, a kid in a heritage sweatshirt argued about marketing budgets into the thin air of a phone call. He gestured with his free hand like he'd invent a possibility by pointing at it. I recognized him because he looked like everyone I hire, impatient with theory, ravenous for application. You know, Ryan said, you never answered the dean's email about the commencement address. I didn't apply to give it, I said. He laughed. Say yes. You love a captive audience. I love audiences who think, I said. And who pay vendors on time. He nodded toward the steeple on the business school's old building. You could tell them the line. Which one? The one you didn't say at the gala. He tilted his head. The policy one. I watched the light catch the copper letters of the school's name, watched a student take a photo for an application essay about the future. The rejection letter I had folded and unfolded 100 times was not a wound now, it was a map. It had pointed me away from wanting in and toward building out. You aren't less whole when a door closes, I wanted to tell them. You just become someone who learns hinges. We started back toward the city. My phone buzzed with a calendar reminder, gift disbursement checkpoint, governance compliance review, bond coverage test. Dull, transparent, holy. Under the reminder, a note from Catherine, accreditation liaison pleased, suggests we publish a governance blueprint for peer institutions. I typed a reply, do it. Publish the clauses. Make it ordinary. At a traffic light, a student jogged up, breath visible in the cold. Ms. Rao, he asked, careful, as if saying my name might shatter something glass. When I nodded, he blurted, I was rejected here twice. I'm at the state school down the road. I just wanted to say, thanks. For the scholarships. And for, he gestured vaguely back toward the stone buildings, this. I looked at him and saw the version of me who had counted exit routes at galas, because you never know what will try to keep you in. Come build something in the incubator, I said. And send me your receipts. He laughed, startled. My receipts? Proof, I said. Of effort. Of outcomes. Of help given and help taken. The world needs receipts more than it needs stories about polish. The light changed. He ran toward his campus, and I walked toward mine, which was everywhere now that I understood ownership correctly. It isn't a plaque. It isn't a fortress. It's a set of obligations attached to tools. Tonight I had used the only language certain rooms here, governance, covenants, ratios. I had put stipulations where myths had been. They would call it revenge because that is what people call justice when it embarrasses them. I called it maintenance. Back at the office, I filed the countersigned documents and scheduled the first scholarship disbursement tranche. I reviewed the board's minutes and annotated the parts where they become eloquent about doing the right thing for reasons they'd recently learned. I approved Natalie's proposal for a student advisory council to meet quarterly with the foundation's staff. I emailed the CFO about a shared services pilot so the university could stop overpaying for procurement. I texted my mother a photo of the bronze plaque, she sent back a heart, then another heart, then the words, "You're still not allowed to gloat." I promised her I wasn't. On my desk sat the original rejection letter, framed not as a trophy but as a calibration device. When I'm tired, I read the phrase, not an ideal cultural fit, and I remember that culture is a thing you write down and then act out, not a weather system you endure. I slid the frame back against the wall and turned to the window. The city ran on loops below, buses, school crossings, a truck backing into a dock in the alley where once I had learned what credit means when you have nothing to trade except your word and the speed of your hands. In another office, in another city, a board would meet next week to discuss a millstone that felt like a milestone until the math changed. They would tell themselves stories about polish because polish had worked. Maybe one of them would call me. Maybe I would answer. If I did, I would speak the same language, not vengeance, not victory, just verbs. The university that had once told me no now had my signature on its bylaws and my conditions in its operating calendar. I had not purchased its soul. I had attached its promises to the people it purports to serve. I did not need to own it to own the outcome. They would tell 100 versions of the Gala story, the anonymous benefactor, the reveal, the conditions like thunder. They would put the right adjectives on it for whatever audience needed the night to feel like a story and not a system. I will not correct them. I will refresh the spreadsheet, sit with the scholarship committee, ask procurement to bid a contract again, and keep the covenants that keep the mission upright. 15 years ago, an envelope told me I didn't belong. Tonight, I instructed a famous institution to follow its own rules. There is a word for that is not revenge. It is stewardship.